Welcome to Valor in the Face of Racism, the history of African Americans in the military. My name is Bill Whitaker. I'm correspondent with 60 Minutes. And with us today is General Vincent Brooks. General Brooks is a retired Army 4-star general. He was the first Black, first captain at West Point, the U.S. Military Academy's highest cadet position. Good morning, General. When we last met, we were at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone in Korea. You were the commanding general of U.S. forces in South Korea. How has your understanding, your appreciation of African-American military history shaped your life and your career?
Well, Bill, it's good to be with you and good to see you again. We're a little bit warmer today than we were that day out on the demilitarized zone. I have always had an appreciation for military history in general, but particularly the contributions of African Americans to that military history and to American history. It has always been part of what I believed I needed to live up to, that there were those who had come before me, and it was my turn to take my place in the line and to not let them down. In other words, to pursue excellence in everything that I tried to undertake. And so this has always been a part of who I am, and it remains so today.
You are the perfect person for this conversation because your family is the only African-American family to boast 4 general officers. Through the Quander branch of your family, you can trace your history back to the 1600s. Tell us about your family and its history.
Well, I could talk for hours about my family. I'm very proud of my family and my place in it. Honestly, I feel like in many ways I was just trying to keep up with some high achievers in my family who came before me. But just a little bit. So the Quander line flows through my mother, and it's one of the oldest and best documented African-American families. And many of them originated as slaves, of course, in Virginia, and ended up on plantations in the Northern Virginia area. At Gunston Hall, George Mason's plantation, and at Mount Vernon as well, where a very well-traced root of the family tree can be traced. And manumission occurred early. It was well before the Civil War. It was actually after the death of Bushrod Washington. And his slaves were released. There had been many of Martha Custis's slaves as well prior to that point in time. And they began to farm in Northern Virginia and were businessmen and actually did quite well. So the long route of that begins in Virginia and eventually migrates across the Potomac River into what is now Anacostia and in what is now the Navy Yard of Washington, D.C., and then further into Maryland and into Pennsylvania. And we've had family reunions every year for about 100 years now without fail. And that's pretty unusual for an African-American family. Mm. And so it's on that side that we trace 4 generals, the 3 in my immediate family who are Brookses, and one cousin who's still on active duty as a brigadier general. That's Mark Quander. He carries the family name still. The Brooks side of my family tree also has clearly some military history in it, as the Brooks family is the only African-American family to have 3 generals within 2 generations. So my father, my brother, and I. And I'm third in the sequence, and thus the point about just trying to keep up. But my great-great-grandfather really was the first one to have military experience, and it was as a body servant. And maybe we'll talk about that a bit more. But he was a body servant for a Confederate officer in Virginia, out near Middleburg, which is where the plantation was that he had been raised on, about 20, 21 years old at the time. And he fled for freedom through the Confederate lines and the space in between to the Union lines, and was again picked up to be a body servant now by a Union officer. So he literally was on both sides, and saw battle in several places with his boss at the time. It's not clear whether you could really call him a slave at that point, but certainly the person for whom he was providing service at the time, who went on to distinction on the Battle of Gettysburg, as it turns out. So that's the Brooks line. My father then becomes the first one regularly committed into the military as a commissioned officer through the Reserve Officer Training Corps program at Virginia State College, as it was called then, graduating and commissioning in 1954 as a second lieutenant. And went into the infantry and then changed to the Quartermaster Corps a little bit later in his career as a young officer, and spent the rest of his career as a logistician. So it was his example that opened the door to our military service. And I grew up in a military family. We moved from place to place like military nomads do. And at 29 and a half years of service, my father retired. My brother and I were on active duty then. Indeed, the day of his retirement was the same day of my promotion to captain. And my brother was already a captain at that time, having been 1 year ahead of me at West Point with the class of 1979. So that's really our journey. I have a sister also who's not in the military, but she still runs the house, just as my mother did until her recent passing.
General, you are really fortunate to be able to trace your family back that far.
Yes, you're right. It's unusual.
Along with your family, there are two other pioneering Black military families with multiple generations of generals, the Davis and the James families. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, clearly great exemplars in the history of the United States and trailblazers. The Davis family is, I'll call them the first family of African-American military senior officer history. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. had been enlisted in the famed Buffalo Soldiers. So he was a cavalryman and met an officer named Charles Young. And we'll perhaps talk some more about Charles Young, but a West Point graduate, a regular Army officer who inspired him to seek an officer's commission. And indeed, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. did seek and gain a commission as an officer. He went on to become the first African-American regular general, as in regular forces, not volunteer forces, and was not given the types of commands that we would want to see a cavalry officer attain. Often the story becomes through history, even when there are qualified African-American officers, they're relegated to duties that are secondary to the primary mission. Being an instructor, for example, or being an inspector general, as Benjamin O. Davis Sr. did. But his son was then inspired by having grown up in a military family to attend West Point and became the fourth graduate of West Point. And what's notable here is the one who preceded him was that same Charles Young. But the span of time was from 1889, when Charles Young graduated, to 1936, when Benjamin O. Davis Jr. graduated from West Point. An incredible gap of time that's perhaps worthy of diving into a bit more deeply about what happened in society that created such a large gap in time. And so Benjamin O. Davis Jr., of course, goes on to become a famed Tuskegee Airman and really leads them in combat as a commander and as a group commander, and helps to create that great distinction of the Red Tails who still serve today. This is the first family, without doubt. And of course, Benjamin O. Davis Jr., while rising to the rank of three-star general, lieutenant general, was later elevated by President Clinton to four-star general. And I was so honored to be physically present for that event. That was an incredible piece of history for me to witness personally. I had met with General Benjamin O. Davis Jr. several times and shared some of his life story. And he was very generous with giving me tips and realizations about what he faced, and what an inspiration that was for me to never flinch and never give up, especially after the things he went through as a cadet at West Point, where he was silenced by his class for 4 years. A few of them engaged in social intercourse with him, but most would not. Officially, he was sanctioned, but he still made the grade, and as a result was able to graduate and be commissioned. He was actually an Army officer first, and then of course joined the fledgling Army Air Corps at that time, and then became a United States Air Force general after the great divorce of 1947, as I refer to it sometimes, when the Air Force was created as a separate service. That's the first family. And so, we really can think about other ones. The James family is another one. And for the Air Force, they clearly are the first. And General Chaffee James becomes the first four-star general for the United States of America in the United States Air Force. A distinguished combat veteran. He flew missions in multiple wars and was gallant and had been decorated for his bravery and his combat action. He was also a commanding officer, which was very unusual to be able to command over and over again. And he rose to the rank of four-star general. Of course, there were many efforts to sideline him as well, but his son, Daniel James, goes by Danny, was a three-star general in the Air National Guard. So he also was an airman, wore the blue cloth of the United States Air Force, and rose to be a three-star general. A very great guy. I mean, I got to meet him and know him as well. So the connections between these, if you will, famous families is personal. These are connections where we actually knew one another and drew inspiration from one another. I was a brigadier general at the Pentagon when I got to meet Lieutenant General Danny James, and we spent quite a bit of time talking and comparing notes as well. But he inspired me. He said I inspired him, but clearly it was the other way around. He inspired me, and both of them passed away too early. I want to throw one more family out, actually two more family names that I think are worthy of mention when we talk about achievement in the senior ranks as generals. There's the Honore family. I don't want to walk past them. Mm-hmm. While they are cousins, there are still two African-American generals with the name Honore. And the additional family is the Chambers family. And this is the only family that is across services with two flag officers, generals and admirals. We call them flag officers. So the Chambers brothers were in the Navy, Lawrence Chambers, and in the Army. And that's Andrew Chambers, who rose to the rank of three-star general. So Lawrence Chambers to two-star admiral, and then Andy Chambers to three-star general. And it was an honor for me to serve underneath of his command in Europe when he was a corps commander, which was very unusual to have that. Only one other had done that prior to him. A three-star general in command of field forces standing against the Soviet Union in Germany. What an inspiration that was. And then I followed him into a command a few years later, Third Army, where that was the army that George Patton had famously commanded in World War II. Mm-hmm. And Andy Chambers later commanded that Third Army, and then so did Vincent Brooks a bit later. So these are other families that I think are certainly worthy of note.
Well, the stories of these Black families and their military histories are fascinating, and your grasp of the history is impressive. We have a video with content from the archives that reviews other military stories. So let's take a look.
Black military history is a rich history, and it's not that well known. And it goes back 300 years. Blacks were always brought into military service when there was a need for additional bodies and blood. But when the conflict was over, then blacks were sent back into servitude. But nevertheless, they fought. And every war we've ever been in, blacks stepped forward because it was the one place they could demonstrate equality. They weren't slaves, they weren't being oppressed. They may be in segregated units, and they may not have gotten the same pay or rations or equipment as white soldiers, but nevertheless, they were able to show that they were as brave and courageous as any other group of Americans.
I was appointed by the President as a Deputy Commissioner of the USSR Standing Consultative Commission. And this is a small group of Americans and Soviets who would meet in Geneva, Switzerland, to arbitrate alleged violations of the ABM Treaty.
It's like being born again in that here in this nice, snug, comfortable cockpit, and then all of a sudden you're out there in temperatures well below zero. You got a wind blowing against you of over 300 miles per hour, and you're pretty well protected, but at the same time, you sit there and you wonder, I hope all this stuff works.
The only thing that saved me was the fact I got wounded a day before my unit got chased out, and I had been evacuated from the area. My battalion that I was in ended up by having 5 officers to come out alive at that time. Either they were killed or captured.
In the formation, I'm the last guy to go across the target. First 4 guys went across the target, radio became alive, and everybody's cursing, yelling, what the, and you could see the red traces coming back toward us, all along the cliff. It was right on the cliff, right on the edge of the water, with these radar stations on top of this cliff. And as I go right across the top of the target, treetop height, something says, boom! I look up and there's a hole right above my head in the canopy, and fire came up out of the floor right in front of the stick. I ended up about 10 feet off the ground. Scratches, bruises down through the trees.
So you were hanging?
I was still in the chute.
10 feet off the ground.
About 10 feet off the ground. And by the way, I was only kept from hitting the ground because the parachute caught in the tree. 50 feet of 100 feet, German soldier. Ach so, ja, Leutnant. I said, oh, hell, you got it. So they were right there underneath. So that was my introduction to 9 months in Germany as a prisoner of war.
As time goes by, I find no need to cry. Though fate has frowned upon my upturned brow, and happiness has mostly passed me by, I still await the hand of saving grace. For 6 long years, I've sat behind these bars, sometimes too cold, more often, though, too hot. Through windows small at night, I watch the stars and wonder why, to me, befell this lot. To cry would seem to say that I am weak. Though 6 long years detained, my strength has rested. And often from here, my fate looks naught but bleak. Still, I must stand and try to meet the test. I'm still a man, and though I'm badly bent, I'll hope and strive until my life is spent.
I remember the first night that we arrived at Da Nang Air Base, we had a rocket attack like an hour after I got there. And being 19 years old, never been in combat before, didn't know much about combat, never even read about it, didn't watch it on television. Didn't have a clue except what I'd been taught for the 2 years that I'd been in the military. And I remember the first night when we had that rocket attack and I just got there, the siren went off and rockets were coming in and everybody had their helmets and their flak jackets and their weapons and they went running. And they were going to a bunker, but I didn't know where the bunker was. So, so I figured, well, I'll just run where everybody else ran. And I followed and found the bunker. But that was probably one of the most interesting nights in my life.
It was a bombing mission up in northern Laos. Once again, mind is a powerful and strange creation. I never once thought that I was gonna die. And when we were flying and people were shooting at me, I never thought it was gonna hit me. I didn't do anything. I mean, I would take whatever maneuvers necessary to dodge. But it was almost like a game, and my mind just shut it out. I mean, it was literally no conscious fear. I have been on the ground near the end of my second tour, coming into my last month. I began to think about getting home.
When I crashed in the jungle on Martai, and was in the jungle for 2 days, and everything in the jungle has thorns, it tore up my legs. And when I got rescued by one of our patrols that was out looking for me, they weren't supposed to. They were supposed to stay at home until somebody found the crash so they could know where to go. But he said he couldn't sit there on his duff while 2 men were out in the jungle, and he had a patrol available. So they went out a day early, and I walked into their patrol on the second day that I was out. And they took me to base hospital, on one of the PT boats of a fellow by the name of John F. Kennedy was a lieutenant in charge of PT boat squadron 109.
Some of the fellows who requested the Red Tail to escort them over Berlin were the same fellows who didn't want black fighters escort in the first place. But they had done so well with them until they said, hey, we got to get those Red Tails to go with us on this first flight.
Why were you dubbed Red Tails?
Because the tails were painted red, and the nose of the plane was painted red. And because of that red tail, that whole back of the plane painted red, you could see this just like that. And many pilots who saw the red tails and the B-24s didn't know that they were black flying them. I think in one case, wherein a group of pilots came to the camp one day, they had been in trouble and the red tail got them out of trouble. So they came, after they went to that base, they came up, said, we're looking for the red tails. And we are the red, you are the red tail, but you're black. Yes, we are the red tails. And the attitude changed.
We carried 8 rafts to storm the tour. We lost 6 of the rafts. Only had 2 rafts. And once Agner got ashore and got a line over, and the second raft, I told him, I said, you know, let's go, because ice was forming on all our bodies and everything, and every time a wave would come and wash 15 or 20 people off, the ship had broken in half. And the after part had drifted off and sunk, and everybody was up on the bow part, and we were standing there, the other 3 blacks, and I told them, I said, we're gonna die. They said, well, that's Iceland, they'll probably lynch us if we go ashore. I said, well, at least we can die fighting. I said, let's go.
So I knocked on the door, and I'm getting my spiel together to say, Seaman Radioman Patton, 405-979, reporting. So he opens the door, and I said, Seaman Radioman, and he slams the door. I never even got the rest of it out.
There's been a tradition in my family. We've all fought and sacrificed. And yet I went to Vietnam thinking I had something to prove. Now, if I felt that way, can you imagine what a person that's just, you know, a young kid, 17, 18 years old, right out of high school? I mean, I felt like I had to prove that blacks could fight, that blacks were tough enough, smart enough to be able to lead men into combat. We've been doing it since the beginning of time. I didn't have anything to prove.
I said, listen, let me tell you something. When I took over this squadron, it was number 1. This squadron was uptight. Now the squadron is going downhill. You guys are not doing your job. I said, if you're trying to run me out of maintenance and off the flight line, you're not gonna do it. Because I'm gonna run this squadron even if I run it into the goddamn ground. Now, if you wanna stay here, be on my team, let me know. Otherwise, I'll find you another place to go. All of them said, we want to stay. We want to make it work.
We went into Vietnam with all the right reasons. Our fear of communist exploitation and what was then identified as a domino effect in Asia. Well, 50,000 troops later, we still, hey, you know, what's going on? This is not changing. And you got an endless flow of troops out of China, who at that time was a kingmaker and still is today, and who's a part of the National Security Council on what they will not support. And through a restraint of a lot of people who did not want this to escalate to a nuclear event between China and the U.S. and Russia, we needed to get out of Vietnam. And I think those voices of discontent about staying there had an influence on the government, which is about the way a democracy is supposed to work. The people speak, and the government can get into war, but it's the people that force them out.
What stories, what histories these service members had to share. General, in the video, General Colin Powell said that the history of African Americans in the military has been one of being called up and serving with valor when needed, when called. But after the need has abated, African Americans get pushed back, pushed away again. Do you agree with that assessment? What are your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he highlights the reality of our history. There has been presence from the very beginning. I mean, fighting to protect colonials against Indian attacks. Slaves were authorized to actually take arms during that period of time. That changed over time. So every time there was an opportunity given, there was an opportunity removed, and a presumption that somehow continued to come forward that blacks would not fight. And yet there they were at Bunker Hill. There they were in the plains of fighting against Indian tribes. There they were in the Philippines. There they were at San Juan Hill. Over and over again, blacks have been present. And yet there has continued to be an institutional effort to put an end to that. So it has never been settled in America that the answer to the question of will blacks fight is absolutely yes. It has been proven over and over again, and yet there are presumptions that even linger to this day.
How critical were black soldiers to the Civil War for both the Union and the Confederacy?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. So if you talk about those who were body servants, I think those who were served by them found that they were very important, preparing horses, preparing the camps, preparing food, some of what sustained the Union and Confederate forces. Okay. But we also see that there is a movement toward creating whole units of blacks. And that began first in the Union side, some famous regiments like the 54th Massachusetts, all colored except for the commanding officers. The officers were all white, but all the troops were enlisted. All the troops were African American. And even by the end of the Civil War, a decision by the Confederacy to begin to arm and make units of black troops. That the time ran out. But just before the surrender at Appomattox, that decision had already been made by the Confederacy to actually allow black units, and mostly to prevent them from being taken up by the Union forces and being used against the Confederacy, which had happened over and over again. So there were many units that distinguished themselves, and there were even medals of honor that happened during the Civil War on the part of black troops. This has always been part of the story. It's standing where you live and protecting and defending, even in controversial circumstances like the Confederacy, which was seeking to preserve slavery at the time. I think it's a very interesting story about blacks being on both sides of the Civil War.
Well, this brings to mind the 1989 movie Glory, about the 54th Massachusetts Regiment and taking over Fort Wagner in the Civil War. The movie was about the racism that this regiment encountered. Was that depiction accurate?
Well, of course, it's a movie. It's intended to be entertaining and inspiring, and so I would say yes. It follows the line of the history of the 54th Massachusetts, and then of course things are dramatized to get the point across and to impress the feeling of the moment. But the 54th served gallantly, but the challenges they went through, as you saw in the movie, are true. Trying to get uniforms, some of the internal divisions between freedmen and escaped slaves, the educational differences that came as a result of that, the significance of putting on the brass button with that eagle on it that Frederick Douglass had spoken about so eloquently, and how that once that happened, there would be nothing that would be able to stop the advancement of the colored people. And so we saw all that manifested in the movie, and it's actually from the history of the 54th and other units like them, the 55th, for example. So there are other units that took a similar journey. And then as they got committed to action, invariably into the South, into the Confederate States, they faced additional hardship of what would happen if they were captured. They might be pushed back into slavery. They might be viewed as runaways. They might be executed on the spot. All these things were additional dangers that they faced beyond the dangers of close quarter combat like occurred at Fort Wagner.
And what was the role of Sergeant William H. Carney?
Well, he was essentially, he was rescuing the colors, which used to be one of the most honorable things that anyone could do. If someone carrying the colors would first be someone who was a distinguished soldier, and carrying the colors into battle, if the colors began to fall, in other words, if the color bearer were hit, then someone had to pick up those colors, and the colors would always lead the fight. I'm talking about the flag of the unit at that point in time, and in some cases, the American flag as well. And so a gallant fight occurred there at Fort Wagner, and a Medal of Honor was given for gallantry in action. And this perhaps was a surprise to some, that colored troops would fight that way, would fight with such tenacity, and would continue to advance in assault even after people were beginning to fall. And those colors advancing were in his hands.
Well, while we're in the Civil War era, talking post-Reconstruction, can you tell me about the Buffalo Soldiers and where that name first originated? And also describe the first Black cadets.
The Buffalo Soldiers, of course, that's a term of reference and endearment and honor and distinction for those units that served on the plains, supposedly named by American Indians who saw the woolliness of their hair and viewed that it was like the hair of the buffalo. But their service really predates that. And so as we go from the 54th Massachusetts to the creation of 4 regular regiments in the period of Reconstruction, the 54th were U.S. colored troops. That's what they were called. USCT followed their name, not U.S. So they were not regular troops. They were special troops, U.S. colored troops. And many of the veterans of the Civil War stayed around and wanted to continue to serve. But as we have talked about before, there was an effort to move them out of service, get them out of uniform. Some were able to hang on, often taking reductions in rank and coming back in as regular privates, even though they'd been sergeants and sergeants major and color sergeants during the time of war. A very classic illustration of this effort to try to cast them out, even when they'd earned the right to bear arms and the right to serve the nation and the right to be free. But the creation of 4 Black regiments, where the troops were all Black, the officers were all white, 2 in the cavalry and 2 in the infantry, joined the regular Army force, which was not very large at that time. I don't remember the total number of regiments that were available to the Army, but it's not very large. And given that 4 of these regiments, 2 cavalry, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and 2 infantry, the 24th and 25th Infantry regiments, would be committed to service in the frontiers of the United States, but also in training at different locations. The 9th and 10th Cavalry were very instrumental in training equestrian skills. They were great horsemen, great cavalrymen. Their record of discipline exceeds those of their counterpart white regiments. There was often a concern about that they would be undisciplined and that they would be rowdy in towns. But what happened more often than not is they were pushed into camps way out on the frontier and were far from society. Where they were tied into small societies, like in the Arizona-Mexico border, sometimes there was friction between white ranchers. Sometimes there was harmony with them and local town folk. But invariably, there were pockets where if they happened to be committed, then there was a challenge that would face those regiments, and they had to be extra disciplined and extra careful about citizens who were out there, especially as Reconstruction waned and as Jim Crow came into place. So these regiments are in place throughout the late 1800s, serving on the plains. Some of them are called into action in the Spanish-American War, that first expeditionary war away from America's shores, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in the Philippines. And as they had for many, many occasions before that, throughout their existence, they distinguished themselves. Now, to the question of cadets at West Point, let me just talk about that for a second, because they're connected. West Point received permission to allow African Americans to receive appointments into the military academy. And those appointments began in the mid-1870s, mostly from the South, as we saw many achievements happening in the former Confederate states, senators, state senators, et cetera. Appointments occurred. 3 went through before 1 graduated. And the actions that happened at West Point were that silent treatment, also known as the silence, where there was no social intercourse and interaction between cadets of different races. And there was animus directed toward cadets who were in the Corps of Cadets. No matter what their class was, so let's say a freshman is there and there's a junior there, they were still required to room together because the blacks had to be together. Whether that was an intention to provide mutual support or another vestige of segregation, or perhaps both, that's how it was done. It wasn't until the 3rd cadet entered that we had a graduate, and that's Henry Ossian Flipper, coming in from Georgia and enduring the hardships that faced him. He wasn't alone when he first got there, but he was alone by the time he graduated, and was the only one who graduated. The others had been pushed out for academic reasons, viewed as deficient in some subject, sometimes an arbitrary decision made, you're deficient, you're out. Or that they endured physical attacks, as Johnson Whitaker did. And as a result, they didn't complete. But Henry Flipper did, 1877. Now he's a regular Army officer, commissioned in the cavalry. Where do you put a cavalry officer who's black? Well, I don't know. There really was no place for a black officer, but the decision was made to send him to one of the Buffalo Soldier regiments. And he served there for several years and did very, very well. I mean, there's a famous painting about Henry Flipper leading a patrol down to the Mexican border to locate a bandit named Victorio, who was troubling both the Americans and the Mexicans. And both the forces had been trying to converge on this Victorio, who was moving from one side of the loose border to another and raiding farms and ranches that belonged to Mexican ranchers and American ranchers. So both nations had an interest in catching this Victorio. And Henry Flipper went out on a patrol to find him and found the place where he was likely to water next, and raced back to the main column, led by a famous general from the Civil War, Benjamin Grierson. He was a brigadier general now, hated horses, didn't want to be in the Army in the first place, was a music teacher in Ohio when the Civil War occurred, but ended up leading the famous raid that went across Mississippi, down into the heart of the Confederacy, and approached Vicksburg from the east, while Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman were approaching from the west and from the north. A little known story. And he was picking up black troops along the way who would end up supporting him, freed slaves as he passed by. Well, he's still in service now in the 1880s. And this mission occurs. The main column now begins to advance on Victorio at Rattlesnake Springs. They ultimately did not capture him, but Henry Flipper had distinguished himself by the horsemanship that was involved in that, riding miles and miles at a gallop and helping to lead that regiment. But back in garrison, where trouble always occurs, he faced the same ostracism that he endured at West Point and was carried into his regiment. Some of the white officers, some of whom were even his classmates, didn't believe he should have been there in the first place. And they found ways to essentially entrap him. Now, there's more to the story of these sorts of things, as always. While he was accused of embezzlement as the quartermaster officer who was responsible for maintaining the stores that supported the squadron that was located there, a small portion of the regiment, it appears that he was actually set up and the money was stolen, and then he was accused of having stolen the money or lost count of it, and therefore he was brought up on charges. But what was behind the scenes is a relationship that he had with the sister-in-law of his troop commander, a white captain, whose sister-in-law came to visit her sister at the frontier camp. And as would happen in the social activities of a small military camp, the officers and the officers' wives and associates would engage in social activity. And Henry Flipper did that also. And a relationship developed. And that offended some of the white officers in that unit. And so they wanted to find a way to get rid of him and brought him up on charges. When it was all said and done, Bill, he was not found guilty of embezzlement, but instead was found guilty of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. What does that mean? So that was the excuse for finding a way to dismiss him. And, you know, the famous leaders who went on to gain a lot of fame in military history were part of that, part of drumming him out, like William Rufus Shafter, for whom Fort Shafter in Hawaii is named, also nicknamed Pecos Bill. You've heard that name, Pecos Bill. That's William Rufus Shafter, who as a colonel drove out Henry Flipper and caused his characterization of service to be dishonorable. Well, I've given you the long story of Henry Flipper, but that's what came after West Point when Henry Flipper unlocked the door. And by the time 1889 rolls around, Charles Young has now graduated as the third graduate coming out of there and gets assigned to the Buffalo Soldiers as well, as we talked about before. So I'll stop there because, again, this is a long history that has not been told. And I'm happy to tell it all, but I probably should stop and let you moderate me here.
No, it's fascinating. But the history you're laying out is one of Black advance and then pushback. And as you said, the next one to graduate wasn't until the mid-30s, so from West Point. So that sort of brings us to the next era. In the 1940s, we have the history of Pearl Harbor with the hero Dory Miller. We've got the Tuskegee Airmen. We've got President Truman with his integration of the armed forces. Can you describe that period of military history for Black service members as well?
Yeah, sure, Bill. It's a very important inflection point in American history, but also in African American military history. This give and take of opportunity. By the time the attack at Pearl Harbor occurs, there are still regular regiments, the 24th, the 25th Infantry, the 9th and the 10th. They're still in service. They've been fragmented out to a number of places and have been engaged in instruction in some places, like I mentioned, equestrian training at Fort Leavenworth, at the Cavalry Training School, at Fort Myer, Virginia, overlooking the nation's capital. George Patton called them some of the best cavalrymen he'd ever met. That would be important a few years later. And at West Point, where they trained all of the famous cavalrymen coming out of West Point from the late 1880s until the 1940s. They were the instructors who taught equestrian skills and are recognized by that at Buffalo Soldier Field as soon as you come in the gate at West Point out of Highland Falls. So we have these units that are out there. You have some very experienced veterans, some of whom were around from as early as the war with Spain in 1898 to 1902, or with the Philippines, or with World War I. There's still, some of them are still out there in the formation. We have a general, Benjamin O. Davis Sr. He's a general when the war starts, brigadier general, inspecting in different places, essentially as an inspector general. But we also have years of a deliberateness of presuming and capturing into policy that blacks must be kept in menial roles. They had over and over again proved themselves, like in World War I, the 369th and 370th Infantry Regiments of the 93rd Division, fighting under French command, earning medals of honor, in spite of the fact that they had been pushed aside, with an official policy that said that black infantry units must be converted into pioneer infantry. In other words, they do field menial labor. They build the famous trenches that separated the edges of no man's land. They build the embankments, the bunkers, what have you. They create the artillery positions. They do menial work in the field. They don't engage in assault, carrying the tip of the bayonet, the tip of the sword to the enemy, even though they were capable of doing that. But some had been passed to the French command, which had a great diversity to it at the time, not well known. They had numerous African troops. They had black generals in the French Army command coming from Africa. And they had these regiments of US black troops, regulars who had been committed there. And so these are still around by the time World War II occurs, but the policy is that they can't do this kind of work. And so whether it's in the Navy, cook steward types of positions, some construction battalion support, driving small vessels, these types of things became the role of blacks. And there were experiments being done because there was always a counter pressure that says, no, this is not right. Blacks can and should serve, and they should have the right to stand up as free men and women who are fully counted, who can earn a vote, who can earn a wage. All these things were also present in our history, pushing to make sure that there was fairness. And experiments like the Montfort Point Marines or the Tuskegee Airmen, these are experiments that came out of the preparation for World War II and conduct of World War II. And they distinguish themselves in every case.
Well, General, as we know, integration of the U.S. Armed Forces did not happen overnight. Can you tell us about the impact of integration on the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and how that might reflect what was going on in society, American society in general?
Well, integration did not occur overnight, although there were occasions, as a matter of policy, it did not occur overnight. In practice, sometimes it did literally occur overnight, where someone was needed or an attack occurred, and there are many examples of attacks that happened in Japan, happened in the Pacific by Japan, and suddenly the black troops who were engaged in menial work along the areas where the footholds had been seized were suddenly in close combat. And so integration occurred overnight, literally, in those cases. Integration occurred overnight when the Tuskegee Airmen, 332nd, were given a mission to escort someone, and you have white and black in the air together in combat against a skillful enemy. So there were many occasions of integration happening overnight. Integration happened overnight when the 761st Tank Battalion ended up getting committed for more than 180 consecutive days of combat in World War II, leading the charge for General George Patton in many cases, being the first to cross rivers and being told to back up so that a white regiment could actually cross and gain the history. These things were the nature of integration. It was a fact in many cases, and yet not a policy. The policy was to keep separate until President Truman's order in 1948. So that officially ended segregation of units in the military, but didn't end it in practice by any means. My father ended up joining right after the Korean War, and there was still the practice of segregation in installations, in the things that supported the military in local communities, whether it's housing or banking or what have you. In Korea, there were actions to officially integrate units, but even that was done in a somewhat segregated way. So you heard General Julius Becton in the excellent video we just watched a few moments ago, speaking of being wounded and being evacuated the day before his unit was pushed off the battlefield. Well, that was the 9th Infantry Regiment, which I later commanded as a battalion commander. I commanded a portion of it, the 2nd Battalion. Each of the units had 2 white regiments and two white battalions, a subset of a regiment, and 1 black battalion. So they were still segregated and yet desegregated. The officers were still largely white. There were some exceptions like General Becton, who was a commissioned officer at the time and a World War II veteran, as well as now a Korean War veteran. There are several examples of that. So this is what the initial throes of desegregation looked like. It was still a contested environment with regard to opportunity and equality. And that contesting carried well beyond the period of official desegregation, just as it did in American society. It was a long time past Brown versus Board of Education until the city of Alexandria, where I grew up, literally desegregated schools. It was a much longer time. It was a much longer time since the authority to vote was granted at the end of the Civil War and the Voting Rights Act was signed almost 100 years later. And it looked the same way in the military. Even though there was legal authority, there was not practice.
The year 2020 has seen a number of historic promotions of African Americans into leadership roles in the U.S. military. Can you tell us about those promotions? And 2, can you tell us about the trajectory of Blacks in the military over the past 50 years and what that's meant?
Well, there have been very significant promotions, and most notably in 2020 is that of General Charles C.Q. Brown to become the first African American to lead one of our military services as Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. In many ways, a great fulfillment of that experiment at Tuskegee some years ago. And he carries that. He's been very clear about that. He carries that history in him. And many of us who admire and respect him so much know that he's carrying that. And he will not let that history down, without a doubt. But so that's the most significant one. There have been achievements that happened before that, from Blacks being allowed to command large formations in combat. That really began to emerge in Vietnam. And people like Roscoe Robinson, who became the first 4-star general in the United States Army, ended up commanding combat troops in a war on the front line, doing what it is those combat troops can do. And they were integrated units, and he did so with distinction. Of course, there were those who were trying to push him off to the side to slow down his career. And then there were others, like some of his West Point classmates, particularly recently passed General Edward C. Shy Meyer, who went on to become the Chief of Staff of the Army, who made sure that there was, there's going to be fairness here. And Roscoe Robinson is an excellent officer. He deserves to be treated as such. He went on to command the famous 82nd Airborne Division, which is the place where my very first unit of assignment was. And he was an exemplar for me and for many, that it could be done. You can be a combat infantryman and lead large formations. That then advances through larger and larger commands, like General Becton, that same World War II and Korean War veteran who ends up becoming a corps commander as a 3-star general. Or General Andrew Chambers that I talked about, who commands a corps and then an army as a 3-star general. Then it moves on into what we call the joint world. That's the place where all services are brought together under a single command, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and sometimes Coast Guard. And we see in recent years, people like General Lloyd Austin commanding United States Central Command in combat, or commanding U.S. Forces Iraq, or even my assignment as the first African-American to command the United States Forces Korea and United Nations Command, as well as the combined United States and Korea Combined Forces Command. These are firsts that are still happening in the present time, firsts for African-Americans. Even though we've been present since before the Revolutionary War in formations, and yet there are firsts that are just happening. I had the privilege of commanding the Big Red 1, the 1st Infantry Division, the United States Army's oldest division, but I was the first African-American to command it when I took command in 2009. And so there are many things that are still happening today. And so while we see General C.Q. Brown as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I can tell you there are a lot of firsts that are happening all over the place. My assignment as the Cadet Brigade Commander at West Point was a first. I'm glad it's not the last. It shouldn't ever be the last. It's a great honor to be a trailblazer, to be a door opener, but it's not an honor to be the only one ever. That means something is wrong, that we have retrenched, moved back, as you talked about, as the long pattern of history. And that's our concern now, is that how do you sustain the doors that have been opened? How do you ensure that there is a population of young African Americans who are answering the call to duty just as their predecessors have done for centuries, and that the opportunity is equal, the playing field is equal, and that their chance to advance through excellence, through merit, is equal for them? They have to be there, and they have to survive when they're in order to advance and have a steady stream of Americans that look like America leading our formations and our organizations. This is the challenge of our time. It's to sustain this and not let it slip back.
So, General Vincent Brooks, from your position right now, what does the future of Blacks in the U.S. military look like to you?
Well, there's always danger in prognosticating, but I will take a risk here and say that I believe that the trajectory is going to be as it has been since the 1600s, and that is that there will be service, distinction, honor, character, example, all these things, commitment, courage, all these things will still be reflected by African Americans in our formation and others. So I don't want to single out African Americans, but certainly that's our topic today, that there will be all of these things as there have been. And there may even still be some vestiges of institutional bias and discrimination that require us to be vigilant as a nation and to work against that and to try to work it out. And I do hope that there will be many more that follow the famous firsts that have happened in recent years, and that there's great achievement that happens out there, and that the history, especially, this is the last point, that the history that is essentially yet unknown becomes much better known.
Well, on that, General, HistoryMakers is concerned about collecting and preserving this history, this military history, and the U.S. Army Heritage Center has acknowledged that they're gathering all the information. They only have history of one African American, and that is Benjamin O. Davis. And this is despite having a $25 million fund to digitize all of this history. What would you recommend? How would you say this Black military history should be preserved so we can ensure it for future generations?
Well, Bill, first I appreciate the work of the HistoryMakers to try to archive the stories, the firsthand stories of those who helped to make American history as African Americans. And so that's the most important thing. We have to capture it. We have to archive it. And these archives need to be in the places where Americans and where the world goes to find it. So the Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, for example, the various service museums that exist, including the very recently completed United States Army History Museum, the African American Museum associated with the Smithsonian, the National African American History Museum of Culture, The Smithsonian's larger, more traditional institutions, the Military Academy, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, all of these places have archives that record some of the notable history that they have sought to capture. So I want them to ensure their doors are open. But more importantly, those of us who have some of the history need to be knocking at the door and saying, I have something for you. I want you to consider this, and I want you to put it on display so that America knows the full history that has not yet been taught. And that is an action that people like me have to take. We have to knock on the door and say, there's something here for you. Take this and offer it to them.
General, this has been enlightening. You are a font of information. And as a former student of African American studies and African American history, it has been a real honor to sit down and take this time to talk to you. We are fortunate today to have members of the MilitaryMakers, who are advisors to HistoryMakers in the area of the military. The committee members include, from the Air Force, Colonel Victoria Bowens, retired, Colonel Al Mosley, retired, retired Colonel Will Gunn, Chief Master Sergeant Clarence Frazier, retired, Chief Master Sergeant Boston Alexander, and Chief Master Sergeant Charmaine Kelly. From the Army, we have Brigadier General Clara Adams Ender, retired, retired Colonel Edna Cummings, retired Colonel Anita Dixon, Colonel Doreen Hurt, retired, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Lee Lanning, retired, and Commander Sergeant Major Del Jefferson, retired. From the Coast Guard, Vice Admiral Mason Brown, retired, retired Admiral Errol Brown, Commander Shameen Antonio Williams, Senior Chief Petty Officer Russ Davis, retired. From the Marine Corps, Lieutenant General Ronald Coleman, retired, retired Lieutenant General Willie Williams, and Sergeant Major Carlton Kent, retired. From the Navy, Captain Roosevelt Rick Wright, retired. Master Chief Petty Officer Melvin Williams, retired. And retired Master Chief Petty Officer Tim Gill. Also with us are some Air Force junior officers. And we'll start with them. Our first question is from Major Nathan Dial.
General Brooks, good morning. First, I just want to say thanks for the example. You definitely plowed a road so that people in my generation can try to pave it and try to make it easier for the people behind us. On that note, sir, I have a two-part question. So the first part is, when you were at the 10-year point in your career, what were your career goals? And then the second question is, what advice would you give to a young officer like myself who's about 10 years into the game?
Well, Nathan, thanks for the question and thanks for your service. You know, the 10-year mark is a very interesting mark in one's career because you're experienced enough to have a flavor for what it is that you've been undertaking, and maybe you like it and you want to stay on with it, but you're also young enough that you might be looking for other opportunities. What else can I do in my life? I'm highly marketable. I can still go back and get some additional degrees, or I can begin to go into business for myself. That's an inflection point for many people in their careers. And so I would say to anyone what I said to myself, and that is, look closely. Look closely. It's okay to look outside, but look closely when you look outside. Don't be enamored by what appears to be an easier road, a more lucrative road. Instead, ask yourself two questions. What do I really want? And secondly, where will I find it? If you ask those two questions, not just the first, which I find many people do at that point. So what do I want? I want to be able to see my wife at lunch every single day. I want to be able to be in my own house every night. I want to not be cold out in the field. There are many things that you might want. I want to make some money. I want to grow more rapidly and to be able to advance based on my merits more quickly than the way the system of the military advances me. Those are first order things. What do I want? Where will I find it? You might also find that I want order. I want camaraderie. I want importance and value. I want a sense of purpose. That might not be the same place that you find these first order desires. And so a very deep reflection is appropriate at the 10-year mark. That's the time to really think about who you are as a person and what is important to you, what you've learned about yourself and about others, and then apply it. Should you choose to stay, then don't ever give up, okay? Be excellent in everything you do. Don't reach for anything. You know, someone who's a major like you or like I was should not be reaching for being a general. You should be reaching for being an excellent major, and given an opportunity to be a lieutenant colonel. In other words, to advance to the next rank. This is not to say have low ambitions. Have ambitions for yourself that you can go as far as your talent will take you, but recognize that you must continue to build on that talent, burnish it, make it more effective if you want to continue to advance for a longer period of time. But you do that one step at a time. So that's my advice. That's what I learned as a major. Don't reach too far. You'll find yourself falling off the rope, if you will, to destroy a metaphor here. Instead, concentrate on excellence and perfecting your craft and being ready for the next opportunity, not reaching for it.
General, our next question is from Major Jocelyn Flores.
Good evening, sir. I just wanted to thank you for your eloquent speech throughout this whole program. And as evidenced through the program and the videos that we saw earlier, I think the military understands very well the value of diversity, but we struggle, like the rest of America, with talking about race in a constructive manner. In fact, the topic itself has been labeled divisive. So how can we as leaders promote learning about race in a way that furthers the discussion?
Well, Major Flores, Jocelyn, thank you for the question, and thank you for your service. Keep leading the way out there. I think we first have to recognize the realities. What we're doing right now is a part of this journey of having a conversation that's constructive. We have to be honest and open about our history, the good and the bad, the things that happened in Brownsville, Texas, and in Houston, what happened to the 15th New York Infantry, colored, as they got sent to Spartanburg, South Carolina on the eve of World War I, before they were designated the 369th Infantry Harlem Hellfighters. We have to be honest about the whole story in order to recognize where the vestiges of racism have manifested themselves as a matter of policy and as a matter of practice. And that there may still be some of these things that exist in the present time. As much as we don't want it to be so, it is so. It is so, and we have to be honest about it. So revealing the history helps to make it possible to have a conversation, especially when nearly everyone who hears the history says, I didn't know about that. I never heard about what happened to Brownsville. I never heard about what happened in Houston with the 24th Infantry Regiment, a gallant, long-standing regular regiment before it went to World War I. I didn't know that the 11th Illinois colored troops pressed into service got sent to the same camp weeks after the incident that happened in Houston between the 24th Infantry and the local police. This is important history to talk about why there may be issues and why there's a sensitivity that happens when we see any part of that history being repeated, as we've seen in the streets of America here in recent months and years. So this is important. Now, I want to say to you, especially, you got to keep on with the fight. Because if there's anyone who remains extremely challenged and biased against, it's women of color in our military formations. The ability to have them achieve to the level that they have earned is still challenging. And the only way for that to happen is for people like you, Jocelyn, to keep going, remain excellent. Remember what I just said, don't strive for something, just be ready for the next thing that comes. and the opportunities may come to you, and then you demonstrate excellence again and again and again. And before you know it, you're sitting somewhere that no one ever thought you could go, or maybe you even didn't think you could go, but you've demonstrated that someone like you can do it. So this is really important to stay with it. And you can't do that by yourself. There have to be others who are watching and ensuring that the biases that inhibit our women of color now in the formation, that those are eliminated, that they're acknowledged first and then eliminated secondly, and that practice and those behaviors are not acceptable. So this is an important effort for you to undertake and everyone else who's looking at this video.
Our next question is from a member of the committee, General Clara Adams Ender.
Good morning, sir. As a student of history, as I have always been, I was absolutely fascinated by your historical account. There were always women. Would you comment on the role that women played in the military and how they were treated and what contributions they were able to make in spite of it?
Well, General Clara, first I got to salute you because you are one of my heroes, and your historic rise inspires anything that I achieved as well. And as well, your mentorship, your willingness to always give back is always worthy of recognition. So forgive me if I embarrass you a little bit, but you deserve it. So thanks so much for being on today, and thanks for the question. And without a doubt, women were present along the way in various roles. Sometimes they were in clerical roles, sometimes in medical roles, sometimes in unofficial roles where they showed up. Like there was one woman from Spartanburg, South Carolina, who joined her soldier boyfriend, put on a military uniform, and marched with the 369th. Now, she ultimately was found out and was removed from the formation, but the desire to be present and to serve has long been there. But the challenges that face women societally, and then particularly, as I just mentioned, women of color, continue to be a challenge that is not yet fully overcome. Trailblazers like you in the Army Nurse Corps and ultimately becoming the Chief of the Army Nurse Corps. By the way, folks, if you haven't read My Rise to the Stars by Clara Adams Ender, you need to read it. That should be on your reading list. And it's General Clara's story about her rise. And it lays out so much of the answer to the question in much fuller detail than I ever could. But as she faced challenges and prejudices and suppositions that she could not do a certain thing, and that she simply just demonstrated that she could and proved it wrong. And so that has been the plight that women have faced throughout. And whether they have been in medical roles or in now traditional line roles, as we see. We have the first female African-American graduate of the United States Army Ranger School, for example, just recently happened, another famous first from 2020. Doors are being opened now, and women are walking through those doors, and women of color among them. And so I think that's really the story, a long presence, a headwind the whole time on achievement and opportunity, and now successes that are occurring in spite of that headwind and that challenge.
Our next question is from Admiral Errol Brown.
Thank you, General, for a very inspiring and truly insightful stroll through our history. I learned so much today. It makes me even more proud for the opportunity that I've had. My question is, what would you say to our services? What would you say our services can learn and should employ from our nation's racial equity journey? And what can the nation learn from the military's racial equity journey?
Thanks, Admiral Brown, and thanks for your service, for trailblazing and leading the way. And I appreciate the question also. I think that there's much that the military can learn from the society's journey. It can learn that there is the potential of reversal if there is not deliberate action to prevent reversal. That's a very clear example of our history, that society can push things a certain way. Now, you talked about the 369th Infantry at Spartanburg, South Carolina. When they arrived, they were the 15th New York Infantry. They didn't stay there very long because they were essentially feared by some of the white citizens in Spartanburg and in surrounding counties, and they wanted them gone. So the local citizenry appealed, using their influences, to have these troops removed from the area, to not be allowed off post. And so their training program was curtailed. Less than 2 months, they were sent back home, back to New York, and awaited their commitment overseas, essentially incomplete in their training. This can happen. So our society can end up pushing us back through assumptions, presumptions, and suppositions that there's some problem, that there's some sort of issue that means that blacks should not be serving. That can happen in a quiet way, not the overt ways that we saw in the past, but the quiet ways that deliberately trip up someone who's advancing. Put out a tripwire to make an allegation like a flipper allegation that ultimately ends up as conduct unbecoming, but isn't substantiated on any other measure. This kind of thing does still happen. And so we have to be alert in the military to what can happen when there's a societal recoil, even if it's from a small segment of the society. If that small segment is positioned well enough to create that effect, then there's one less minority staying in the formation. We need to be aware of that and be cautious about it and prevent it from happening. What society can learn from the military, from this long history, is that presumptions and suppositions about racially based capability or inefficiencies, they're wrong. Okay, people are people. And people of all races will do extremely well, and people of all races will also fail. That's the reality. People are people. When they're well led, they will perform well. When they're poorly led, they may perform well, but it's in spite of leadership. And more often than not, they'll have more challenges than successes. And if there were ever a good example of that, then the 92nd Infantry Division, another black unit created for World War II, committed into Italy under a racist leader who did not build up his troops, even when they distinguished themselves in combat. It was viewed as an aberration, not a norm. These kinds of things can happen. And so the society can learn that the suppositions are not true. Blacks can and will do anything and everything that there is to be done. Everything. There's not a limitation because of race. And that any policies that artificially restrict that or try to constrain it are wrongful policies. And they need to be eradicated, as the military has repeatedly eradicated and pushed against some of these societal norms. Even integration of the formation is like that. The society pushed back against that during the second era of Jim Crow, the 1950s into the 1970s. The race riots that occurred during that time, as they were called, in cities of America, but also in formations of the military. How did the military work through that and get to a greater representation, a greater meritocracy that the rest of the society desires? There are many things that society can learn about how to do that. Interestingly, in my retired life, I'm engaged with a number of businesses as either an advisor or as a board member. And in every case, they're struggling with the same issue. Much progress has been made with gender equity and gender diversity. Little progress has been made with regard to racial equity and racial diversity. And industry is realizing that now, and that they have work to do to catch up. Well, the very best exemplar that they often turn to is the United States military. Imperfect, yet far advanced when it comes to this effort throughout our society. And I think that can be exported in many ways. How do you choose people? How do you ensure that there's mentorship and development happening? How do you make sure that there's a population that has a chance of being chosen? And then how do you deliberately choose to ensure that there's diversity? These are all examples that I believe can come from the military back into society. So thanks again, Admiral Brown.
Colonel Edna W. Cummings has a question.
Yes, sir. You mentioned about the opportunities in corporate America after retirement, but upon retirement, it seems that our senior Black military officers or enlisted personnel who've served over 20 years not embraced by corporate America and media. So why do you believe that corporate America and the media do not leverage the talent of our senior military personnel once they retire as CEOs, members of boards, even media analysts? You just don't see those numbers compared to their white counterparts. Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel Cummings. Edna, good to see you again. And thanks for your service. Thanks for your leadership and your continued example. I like the question. I think it's a complex equation that says why. Why is that the case? And it's true that there are only some 150 so corporate execs in Fortune 500 companies who are African American in the boardroom. Why is that? Given all this achievement that we've talked about, why is that? I think it's a combination of things. First, I would say it's a lack of awareness on the part of the boardrooms that this pool is out there. They should know, but they don't. And so someone has to help bring that to their attention. And there are groups to do that. Another reason is perhaps some presumptions. Well, you came out of the military, so you may not have much to offer. And that is a matter of education about what veterans of military service can bring. I participated, or actually observed a wonderful event last week called Veterans on Wall Street. And it talks about this, about what it is that veterans can bring to even major Wall Street firms. The same thing needs to happen as we talk about minorities, what minorities can bring to major Wall Street firms and others. So there's an education process that needs to happen so that these businesses know that they have a fertile and ready and highly capable, highly experienced pool from which to choose. There's some good news because of the current spirit in America. There's an awareness of the need to do this. And so corporations like the ones I'm associated with are looking. They're trying to find people right now. And so we may see an improvement here over the next several years. The next component of this perhaps is how marketing is done by the veterans, how to translate their experiences in a way that makes it clear that they can achieve certain things. There's one other dynamic that I think is worth mentioning and acknowledging, and that is that often those who do gain seats on boards of large organizations and companies are very high ranked, like myself. My chances of being picked for a board are far better as a 4-star general than they are even as a 3-star general or as a colonel, like Edna Cummings. And that's a bit unfair because the institution of the military hasn't produced enough to make the population in the boardroom look like the population that we want to see inside of the military. There's a mismatch already, but there's still a deficiency on the military side. And so how do you make sure that a highly experienced colonel like Edna Cummings is visible enough that her talent, not her rank, her talent is seen and can be brought into any organization for benefit? The insightfulness that you bring, Edna, is an example of that. That's an ongoing challenge. And it means people like me who are already in the boardroom have to highlight people who are not in the boardroom and to help point in the right direction. So I'd say it's a combination of things. It's clearly work to be done. We're not where we should be or need to be, ought to be as a society. We're not the more perfect union yet, so we have to still work on it. And this is one way to work on it.
Our next questioner is Captain Rick Wright.
General Brooks, incredible, wonderful, incredible presentation this morning. I'm on the board of directors of the National Naval Officers Association. And my question for you is, well, of course, you've had an incredible background also in that world of public affairs. General Brooks, with the availability of all of the mass media systems that we have in presenting content to the world and to the masses, the question is, and of course, the incredible history that you presented this morning, a lot of people don't know about it. What is your message to the public affairs communities of the 5 services of the United States of America with regards to what we need to do to really get the message out in these many different areas of media distribution systems. I mean, the networks and everybody's on, but our stories are not there. What is the encouragement to, especially to a historian and public affairs officer like yours truly here?
All right. Well, thanks, Captain Wright, and good to see you. And thanks for your leadership. And thanks for still making a difference with NNOA. Your leadership is still required. So I very much appreciate that. I often think about things in complexity. So I'll try to break it down into simplicity, which is one of those things I learned from public affairs officers. You can have a complex thought, but don't communicate it in complexity. There's a lot that has to be done still to get the message out. We've talked about a little bit of that today. So for public affairs officers in the military still, joining with their commanders and with their equal opportunity leadership, advisors, et cetera, when it's time to tell the story, make sure you're telling the deeper story. You know, as I went around giving speeches during African American History Month, and by the way, you know, American history is African American history. They're intertwined. So every single day of history should be African American history. But given the focus of that in February of each year, I was frustrated to find that the stories that were being told were essentially only of the civil rights era, and the military history and the African American contributions to it were not being told. Why? Because they weren't known. And so studying in advance, you know, I know we've got Lieutenant Colonel Michael Lee Lanning on the net today. You ought to read his book. I've got it sitting right in front of me. The African American Soldier. Colonel Lanning, I hope I'm not stealing your thunder, but that's a great book. You ought to read it and use that or others. Gail Buckley's American Patriots. Use other books. Bernard Nolte's Strength for the Fight. I've got them all laying here on my desk. These are the references. These are the references. The military history is deep, and it is full of gallant contribution, and it's also full of hardship stories. We need to tell that story. So public affairs officers need to, as they always do so professionally, expand the understanding of the story. Tell the story with repetition. Move the story into multiple outlets. Here's one, HistoryMakers. And where this archive goes and where people can touch it, that's the history beginning to move, at least as told today. C-SPAN, there was a very excellent set of interviews done by Dr. Kowalski Salter, a retired Army colonel, on C-SPAN about African American military history. If you haven't seen that, you should look it up. You can get to it online now. It's tremendous in its precision and its detail, and he's a great resource. Going to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, asking the questions, where is this story? How come it is not presented? What happened to the artifacts of this person? Putting some demand on the outside can be done by our public affairs professionals who seek in cooperation with media outlets and media officials to get the whole story told. And so I think all of these things can be done. But the very best way is for every individual to have a deeper knowledge and to share it, not to be a know-it-all. You know, I've been accused of being a know-it-all. That's one of those things that you get accused of if you have a good memory in your minority. I've been accused of being a know-it-all. Maybe I am, but I think that the important point here is that you need to know something and you need to communicate it and know it with some detail and some precision so that when it's challenged, you can know what's around it and so that it still stands and doesn't get washed away by counter winds and counterwash. So these are things that I would suggest. And thanks very much, Rick Wright, for the question.
We have a question from Colonel Doreen Hurt.
Good morning, sir.
Doreen?
It was so great to hear you talk about our wonderful history, especially recounting the exploits of a number of my mentors like General Beckton, General Chambers, to name a few. I have a comment and then a question. The ROCs, the National Naval Officers Association, the Air Force Cadet Officer Mentoring Association, strive to strengthen the military services by advocating for and providing mentorship and professional development to increase leadership diversity in the ranks. Despite that, there are many minority officers who shy away from associating with organizations that are perceived to be all Black or mostly minorities for fear that it will negatively impact their careers. What would you say to enlighten and encourage them to participate in these organizations that are working every day very hard on their behalf to increase diversity in leadership? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Doreen, and thanks for your service. You're one of my heroes. Right in front of me, which you can't see. You see a lot of things behind me, but in front of me, on one side is the 369th Infantry Harlem Hellfighters, right in my face. I have to look at them every single day and think about them. And to the right is a great portrait of the last Buffalo soldier in salute that you presented to me at Walter Reed some years ago. So know that you're in my office every single day. I think these organizations are really important. And certainly as a member of the ROCs myself, as a life member, and having been in and out of different ROCs chapters, helped to try to organize some ROCs chapters along the way where there was not one. Each of these organizations, ROCs, NNOA, AFCOA, as you articulated them, each one of them is about mentorship. Early on, each one of them was also about survival, about passing on some, if you will, tribal wisdom on how to survive and ideally thrive inside of each of the services identified. But now it's more about mentorship. It's about passing on understanding and knowledge and wisdom so that we have a more capable pool of rising leaders in each of our services. And the outreach to our senior enlisted ranks is also important. While many of these are created more for officers and cadets, the outreach has gone beyond that now, and the impact is into our enlisted ranks significantly. So the advice that I would give to them is, first, our institutions within the Department of Defense know that they have a challenge and they need some help on creating a more diverse force. These organizations can help. Be a part of it. Bring your perspective, bring your understanding. Secondly, once you're a part of it, don't let it be all African American. Okay, that is the subject, without a doubt. It's the experience of African Americans in the military, and the tribal wisdom being passed on is about how to be effective in that circumstance with the realities that we do face. But everyone should hear that. So it's a great forum. Each of these is a great forum for expanding the knowledge, of telling the broader story, of realizing where there is potentially bias, and realizing that it's not a group gathering to plot overthrows, as I've had suggested to me at different points in my career. What are you guys meeting and talking about? You planning an overthrow? That kind of cynicism that still exists on the outside looking in is in part due to a lack of invitation to come in. And so invite others in. The ROCs chapters that I've participated in recent years in Korea and Hawaii, and I'm about to go down and visit the San Antonio chapter of ROCs here very shortly. There's a mixture of different ranks. There are warrant officers, there are generals, there are captains, there are majors, there are all these different grades in there. So you have some diversity of thought there. And not one of them has been all black. That's great. Okay, so there's perspectives that can be shared, and it carries on the conversation we've talked about. Each of these groups, ROCs, NNOA, AFCOA, are aids to the effort of each of the departments. I'll spare you a long story, but I can tell you that even when you're doing mentorship outside of those organizations, sometimes the institution reacts negatively to it. In Korea, when I was there as lieutenant colonel back in the 1990s, we didn't have a ROCs chapter at the time. And so we gathered on our own to provide mentorship because we had a high concentration of leaders there and could pass on some knowledge and wisdom from the colonel and lieutenant colonel level down. And so we called it the Talented 12th Enhancement Group. And we met every Saturday. So it was off-duty hours. People were invited to come. But it became, there was an allegation made against it. And because it wasn't one of these three organizations, ROCs, NNOA, and AFCOA, it was viewed as illicit. It wasn't allowed to happen. And that's unfortunate. That was an institutional overreaction. The objective is mentorship. But the fact that they acknowledged those groups and said, why don't you join a ROCs group or create a ROCs chapter? It should be done under the rocks. There was at least acknowledgement institutionally that these organizations are beneficial to the outcomes that the military is seeking. And so that's how I'd account for it. Tell them, join, be a part of it, bring something to bear. If it doesn't exist, you and a couple of your buds organize one. Connect to the national level, and you'll be in business right away. I had to do that at Fort Stewart, Georgia, some years ago when I was a brigade commander.
We have a question from Senior Chief Petty Officer Russ Davis.
Good morning, General. You were very enlightening, and I just can't say enough about your information. My question is the enlisted role in the military. How can we improve to the situation?
Okay. Well, Senior Chief Davis, thanks for the question. Thanks for your service. Thanks for asking that question. Let me first say that without the enlisted force in this story of African-American contributions to history, there would be none. Okay. The long story is the enlisted contribution to American history and African-American history within it. Look at the records of medals of honor. You'll find a few officers, Black officers who have the Medal of Honor. You will find many enlisted who have the Medal of Honor. And that says that that's where the true test occurs. It's in the enlisted ranks. You wouldn't have a Benjamin O. Davis Sr. had he not been a Sergeant Benjamin O. Davis Sr. You would not have had a Vince Brooks as a retired four-star general rising through the ranks if it hadn't been for Sergeant First Class Albert Adams, who wanted to make sure that he was an African-American, as I am. He wanted to make sure that I was going to succeed. And he gave me extra counsel on not messing things up. And I'm valuable to, I give credit to Albert Adams, my very first platoon sergeant, or Johnny Rock Riley, or Franklin Bent, one of my first sergeants, others along the line, Charles Thomas, a battalion command sergeant major. These were all African-American enlisted men. And while they were not alone, I had many white enlisted men and Latino enlisted men as well who also wanted to ensure that I was successful. And so I credit to them as well. But to this point, it is the history. And so we want to continue to tell that. And I think for people like you who have served and rose to the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer, need to be able to help articulate what service meant to you and to counter a little bit of the negative themes that come out of the African-American community about military service, that for whatever reason, it's unfair. There's cannon fodder. You have to go in certain places. You won't have any skills when you come out. Some of these things that are still being passed by influencers in our communities and that are ill-informed. What did it really do for you? So the veterans need to speak about what military service actually did for them, especially the enlisted veterans, which will always be the greater number. And so I think that those are some of the answers. So what can be done to improve the situation? That's part of it. Tell the story differently. Make sure you're reaching younger generations and standing firm when moms who worry, rightfully. My mother was a career Army wife and the mother of essentially three generals. You know, she was raising my father while she was also raising me and my brother. And we recognize and acknowledge her in her role of leadership inside of the family. But she was worried. She was worried about her sons. And my decades overseas, she was worried about those every minute. So mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and coaches and teachers and pastors and preachers and priests all have a reason to worry, but they need to be better informed about what the reality is. Yes, there's some danger. Of course there is. And the danger might even be at the expense of one's life. But there's also a tremendous personal reward for having done something that has a purpose. A tremendous benefit that comes from learning how to lead others, no matter what their race or background. A tremendous benefit that comes from being called to stand in front and to be an account when it matters the most, when the test comes. All these things are very important lessons in life, and they help to make better citizens and they change communities. So I think this is the story that needs to be told and especially from the perspective of the enlisted man or woman.
And our final question is from Commander Shameen Antonio Williams.
Hi, good morning, General. What a pleasure to meet you, sir. Military service men and women are held to a higher standard than the citizens of this country. What are your thoughts on the Honorable John Lewis's get in good trouble, necessary trouble, when it comes to service members of color who want to make a difference, but without sacrificing their careers? And can you cite any examples when you got into good trouble in your career? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Commander. I appreciate your service, and thanks for the question. It's interesting that our military is held to a bit of a higher standard. That worries some people on the topic of civil-military relations, that the military somehow may see itself separate and above the society it serves. We have to guard against that. But we shouldn't be shameful or ashamed of the fact that we do live by a high standard. We live by strong ideals. We have a culture of discipline, a culture of uniformity, a culture of expectation of excellence and 100% being given all the time. What's wrong with that? So that's not a bad thing, and we shouldn't be at all ashamed of it. And at the same time, not forget where we came from, that we may be exemplars to many and therefore have to remain connected to them. So that would be the first point that I'd make about that. And in terms of good trouble, let me first say that it's different inside of the military than it is outside of the military. I'm grateful to our deceased Congressman John Lewis, and met with him on several occasions through the years and told him how much I appreciated his good trouble, because his good trouble unlocked some doors for me. I wouldn't be where I am if it had not been for people like John Lewis getting into good trouble. That doesn't mean I can get into the same good trouble. I have to get into a different kind of good trouble. And that means just standing forth as an example. Even when someone says, hey, what are you guys planning over there? Even when someone says, well, you're probably better off taking vocational training, not college preparatory courses. That good trouble is the good trouble of proving people wrong through your example. And I got in lots of good trouble on that. People told me what I couldn't do, or what I wouldn't be able to do, what I would never do. And I'm thankful that I was given the opportunity to do it anyway. Not just because of me, but because of people who gave me a chance. And then it was up to me to do something with that chance. So that's the good trouble you can get in when you're in the military. The good trouble of being in the game, being the exemplar. There are some other examples of good trouble, though, I think as well. When you are in limited number, as I was in so many cases where I'm the only African American in the room, and a matter is being discussed and there's a missing perspective, I'll be gentle and say that. Or in some cases more harsh, where they've got it wrong. Your voice needs to be heard. And that's a degree of good trouble. You take a risk at that point in time. See, we shouldn't have let them in the room in the first place. You take the risk of not being invited back into the room. And that might happen, but you're at least in the room and you have an obligation to say, well, there's another perspective. How you do it matters. How you convey it matters. Get the point across as clearly as you can, and somewhat unemotionally, but certainly coming from a wellspring of experience and emotion. Get the point across in a way that can be received by those to whom you communicate, and then stand on it and stand on the consequences that come with it, which include not being invited in the room again, or being viewed as, we got a bomb thrower in the room now. These kinds of things will happen. You might even be counterattacked. Someone says that, okay, well, we need to slow you down a little bit. I've had that happen to me several times in my career where someone decided to slow me down because I had more time, because I'd been growing rapidly in the military ranks. And so the belief was I had time. And the challenge that you have to get into then is not to fight about it, but to simply demonstrate your excellence again and again, where it is to their detriment to not keep you on the team. And that's the good trouble that I think applies to those who are inside of the military. And this is an important point, because our youngsters want to express it as they see it on the outside. And sometimes they wonder, are the senior leaders, are the command sergeants major, the command master chiefs, are they Are they fighting for us? And the answer is yes, because you know they're there. They're automatically fighting for you. And they tend to fight sometimes behind the scenes and quietly in those rooms where they're the only one. And you're not going to hear that. Have confidence in them and trust that they're there as an exemplar and carrying the torch and setting the path before you. And then when it's your turn, do that also, whether you're acknowledged by the public or not in doing so, whether you're acknowledged by the population that you're trying to blaze a trail for or not, it doesn't matter. It's the right thing to do, and that is what you must do. It's your duty when you're in that kind of circumstance. That's good trouble.
Well, General, you said that you have been called a know-it-all. If you are a know-it-all, it is to our benefit. Sharing your knowledge has been fascinating, insightful, and thought-provoking. We have found that the history of African Americans in the U.S. military is not only one of valor in the face of racism, but one of fierce perseverance and determination. And it's also a call to action to preserve this history. And I would like to thank the HistoryMakers for their work in this area, and also thank them for getting us all together today. And thank the members of the service, the military service, for joining us. But most of all, thank you, General Vincent Brooks.
Thank you, Bill. It's been a great honor to be on with you. It's good to see you again. God bless everyone that sees this video, and I hope that it inspires you.
Thank you.